Good day. After the massive announcements of the previous 48 hours, all pouring out of Moscow and of the territories under Russian control in Ukraine, of referendums to unite with Russia, and of partial mobilization in Russia itself, the last couple of hours have been reasonably quiet, at least on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Constant chatter about Ukrainian offensives in Kherson region, in Zaporozhye, in south of Ugledar, have not so far materialized into any actual real action. There's been quiet in all of these battlefronts. And to the best of the information one can glean, fighting in Kharkiv region along the Oskol River seems to have largely stabilized. Attempts by Ukraine to advance beyond the Oskol River line have so far been unsuccessful. Now, I'm discussing all of these events on the assumption that it is Ukraine that is undertaking the offensives, because after all, over the last few weeks, ever since the beginning of September, it is Ukraine that has supposedly been on the offensive. But so far, up to this point, apart from that breakthrough in Kharkiv region, where Ukraine advanced rapidly into territory which, as is now, I think, clear, as is no longer, I think, reasonably disputed, the Russians were vacating, there's been no significant Ukrainian advances on any particular front. The one place where Ukraine is still maintaining some momentum is in northern Donetsk, where Ukraine continues to make attempts to recapture the important town of Liman, or Krasny Liman, which is defended by an interesting assortment of Cossack troops, some from the Lugansk region, some from Russia itself, backed by Russian armed forces artillery. This has been an intense amount of fighting around there. The Ukrainian army, which apparently in this area consists of around 2 brigades, has been making some incremental progress, but over the last 2 weeks, despite various attempts, they've not yet managed to capture Liman itself. I'm going to make a guess that before very long, we're going to start to see significant Russian reinforcements, probably from within Russia itself, heading precisely to this area of northern Donetsk and northern Lugansk in order to stabilize this particular area of the battlefields, which is the area where the Russians appear to be weakest. Perhaps the most consequential news we've actually had from the battlefronts over the last couple of hours is a report that Ukraine has blown up a bridge which allegedly links the center of Bakhmut city with its eastern section. And I've seen satellite photos which appear to show this as having happened. Now, I presume that this is the case. I'm not an expert in analyzing satellite photos, and of course I have to take the word of it of the Telegraph channel that's providing us with copies of this map, that it is indeed Bakhmut city. It's a pretty reliable Telegraph channel, I ought to say. If it is indeed the case, then it would suggest, at least to me, that the Ukrainians have decided that defending the eastern part of Bakhmut city is no longer possible, and that they're now withdrawing to trying to hold the central areas and the western parts. Now, that would mean that the fighting has now actually reached the central areas of Bakhmut city, which is, to be clear, somewhat further in advance of what I myself had understood to be the case. So I mention all of this in a rather tentative way. We will see whether or not this is true, but the satellite pictures are there. I've no reason to doubt them. I presume that they are accurate. So that seems to me at the situation at the moment. Now, from all of this, I should say that I get the overriding impression that the Russians are letting Ukraine continue with its various offensives and attacks in various directions. They seem to be calculating that the Ukrainian offensive or counteroffensive, which has been dispersed over too many areas. That's, I think, a point I would make. The US apparently advised Ukraine to focus its offensive in one place. That was a report that was circulating a few weeks ago. Instead, they seem to have tried to launch offensives pretty much all along the long front line. Anyway, this offensive seems to be spending itself, and the Russians seem to be calculating that what they should do at this time is hunker down, not try and launch offensives themselves, except, as I said, in this critically important place, which is Bakhmut city, where they are continuing to move forward, and let Ukraine continue to suffer the very heavy losses in men and material that it is suffering, continue to deplete its reserves, even as this massive reinforcement from Russia in the form of these new forces, which were announced the other day in the form of that partial mobilization, which is now taking place until these new forces come into play. Now, I think reaching that point, perhaps a few clarifications about this mobilization or partial mobilization is in order. I saw that Reuters claimed that it was the biggest mobilization that Russia has launched since the end of the Second World War. That may be true about Russia, but it's not true about its predecessor state, the Soviet Union. In 1968, the Soviets deployed around 500,000 troops to Czechoslovakia to suppress the Prague Spring. And that did also require a major call-up of reserves. The actual troops who occupied Czechoslovakia in 1968, as I remember, were not reservists. They were from frontline, full-strength Soviet military formations in East Germany and in Eastern Europe. But they had to be replaced until they were able to return to their main bases by second-line units from within the Soviet Union itself, and those had to be brought up to strength by a mass call-up of reservists. And that did take place in 1968, and I suspect and believe that it was on a bigger scale than what we're seeing with this call-up now. So I just wanted to mention that. People tend to forget earlier periods of history. They make all kinds of assumptions about them. Now, about this call-up that we've now heard about, there's been a lot of clarification from various Russian officials over the course of the day. It seems it is incremental. It seems that the Russians will slowly bring in, call up particular reservists with different specialities, and the focus is on people who have already served in the armed forces. In other words, these are reservists, actual reservists, people who served in the armed forces, and I suspect much of the focus will be on people who've undertaken contract service. Now, the Russian military started to introduce contract service in a significant way during the fighting in the Caucasus in the 2000s, and I suspect a number of the people who are going to be called up are people without those kind of backgrounds. Now, it is important to say again that, as happened with with Czechoslovakia in 1968, it doesn't follow that these people who are being called up will all be sent to Ukraine. It seems to me inherently more likely that what we will see is serving professional soldiers in professional units, contract soldiers, people with existing contracts, sent to Ukraine, in the existing military formations, and other formations, reserve formations, being created to take their place. In other words, we may not be seeing vast numbers of draftees pouring into Ukraine itself. Also, it's important to stress that these are not conscripts. The Russian government has made that absolutely clear, and that there is no general conscription underway in order to draft young men to put them through some hurried training process and to send them to the Ukrainian battlefields. So it's a call up of reserves. And can I just say, and I may be entirely wrong here, people who serve who have served in the US military can correct me if I'm wrong. But I seem to remember from all the various recent wars that have taken place, which the United States has been involved in, Iraq, Afghanistan, and wherever, especially Iraq, that the United States often deploys National Guard troops to these wars, and that the National Guard obviously operates on the basis of calling up reservists. So that what the Russians are doing is, in effect, somewhat similar to what the United States has done with its call up of National Guard reservists to fill up units that are sent eventually to the battlefields. And again, maybe I should say also that to the extent that military units which will be sent to Ukraine, which are made up of these draftees, I doubt personally that they will be the ones that will be earmarked to carry out offensive operations. Much more likely, they are going to be the people who are sent in order to retain control of territory that has been already captured. In other words, to keep the roads open, to guard the less priority areas of the front lines. The sort of people who, if they'd been available, might have been used, for example, to defend Kharkiv region, thereby parrying a Ukrainian attack on that region. So they're more likely to carry out a secondary role, whilst the professional formations continue to be the ones that actually do most of the continued offensive fighting. Now, on that point, perhaps the single most important disclosure made by Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, the one which has been almost completely overlooked, is his statement about the number of Russian losses. He didn't give a number for wounded, but he said that just under 6,000 Russian soldiers had been killed over the course of the fighting. Now, he was obviously not including militia from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. No, he was not including the Chechens or the Wagner Group, all of these particular groups, but he was talking about 6,000 Russian military. Now, that is a significant number of people, but it's certainly not anywhere close to the number of dead Russian soldiers that would be needed to seriously degrade the professional arm of the Russian military, especially given that it's probably been undertaking a churn anyway, with more soldiers enlisting in the professional part of the Russian army since then and making up the difference. So it's likely, if it's a certainty, that the Russians still have, or undoubtedly do have, the bulk of their professional standing army absolutely ready for combat and absolutely ready to conduct combat operations. So that, I think, is where we stand on the battlefields. I'm sorry if this is a somewhat sketchy discussion. This is, as I said many times, an area which is not native to me. I'm not, as I said many times, someone with a military background. But all the facts point me towards the conclusion that what the Russians are doing is that they're letting the Ukrainians exhaust themselves. They're not conducting offensive operations except around Bakhmut, where they continue to be making advances. They're waiting for the autumn rains to set in, and then when the autumn rains and the mud are over and the cold weather has come, they will begin a major offensive with a beefed up army in Ukraine, and they will need these hundreds of thousands of extra troops. Not all of them, however, may be sent to Ukraine, but they will need more troops in Ukraine to hold the large amount of additional territory that they expect to capture. That's how it overall looks to me. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation, the military situation. Let's now turn to topics which I perhaps am a little bit more secure about. Firstly, I've been asked by various people to comment about these reports that there was a mass exodus of people, young Russians presumably, from Russia in order to avoid the draft. I would take all those claims with a massive cascade of salt. We've seen that before. There were similar claims circulating in the media in March, and they turned out to be untrue. Certainly, the Russian authorities have made it very clear that there's no discussion of enlisting teenagers to fight in this war, and not university or college students either, or people who are going through some kind of educational courses. So if there have been some people trying to leave, I doubt that it's on anything like the scale that you might get the impression about from the media, at least the Western media, and I expect many of these people anyway to choose to return before very long. So that's the first thing to say. The second is that if you're talking about overall mood in Russia, perhaps the best sign is by looking at our old friend, the exchange rate. Now, on the eve of all of these big announcements, the referendum decisions and Putin's speech, one could see a sign of nervousness. There was a drop in the Moscow Stock Exchange, and the ruble fell against the dollar. It was trading at one point at just over $64 to the ruble. Sorry, 64 rubles to the dollar. 64 rubles to the dollar. Anyway, since Putin's announcement, as I understand it, the stock market has rallied, and as of the time of making of this video, the ruble is trading at 59 rubles to the dollar. So it has considerably strengthened, even as the US Federal Reserve Board has been raising interest rates. Now, I don't want to say too much about this, but presumably, if there was an atmosphere of panic and people were trying to flee Russia, they would be trying to get their hands on foreign currency, as they would need if they were to go abroad, and that would presumably be putting pressure on the exchange rate. Well, we saw some pressure on the exchange rate before Putin made his announcements, but after he made his announcements, the exchange rate strengthened. So that suggests that far from a mood of panic, what Putin and Shoigu have said have had a steadying effect. And I would say I've also seen pictures of the protests that have taken place in Russia, the anti-draft protests. Again, to the best, to the degree that I can make out, these have been once more largely young people. And from what I can also see, they've been very small. And these protests seem to have ebbed very quickly. They are the sort of people who, to say it straightforwardly, have been antagonistic to the Russian government for a long time and who would be expected to protest. They're part of the protest community in Russia. I'm not going to try and put an exact number on them, but their totality probably numbers in the tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands. They came out and protested, and the protests, as far as I can see, are fizzling out. My own sense is that there's been, if anything, a sense of a stabilization in the mood in Russia after the events of Kharkiv, which whatever some people want, however some people are trying to spin them, were a major setback for the Russians. There was a very significant increase in nervousness and worry on the home front. There was lots of criticism that Putin and the authorities were not taking the conflict in Ukraine sufficiently seriously. There was some anger that Russian troops were conducting exercises in the Far East, the Vostok exercises, but were not, when they should have been, countering Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv. And there was this explosion of anger, not just on Russian telegram channels, but also on Russian television channels and in letters columns to Russian newspapers. Well, the announcements that we've had over the last couple of hours have now steadied nerves. It now has made people feel that the Russian leadership is indeed taking this situation seriously, and it is doing what needs to be done in order to bring the situation not just under control, but to wage what everybody in Russia sees as a war until the point where it is eventually successfully concluded. So I think that far from being an unpopular move in Russia, this has been a welcome one. And I think, again, many people in the West, particularly people in the media in the West, are seriously misjudging the mood in Russia, as they have been doing ever since this conflict began. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. What about the international reaction? Now, the country that from a Russian point of view matters the most is China. And I read yesterday an article in the Zero Hedge, which appeared to say that the Chinese government, or rather the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, had called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And that would have been a departure. That would have suggested that the Chinese Foreign Ministry was becoming concerned about the situation and was not happy with some of the decisions that the Russian government had been making, and was now calling for, effectively, the Russians to end the operation, to bring the special operation in Ukraine to a stop through some kind of a ceasefire arrangement. I found that very surprising because it was completely contrary to what all the indications that I'd gleaned up to that point. And I therefore followed the links in the Zero Hedge article, and they brought me to a article in a Turkish website, a Turkish news website. And I didn't think that was particularly reliable, so I went to the Chinese Foreign Ministry's own website, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman is Wang Wenbin, and this is what the Chinese Foreign Ministry's own website reports him as having said. And it was said in response to a number of questions from Western media agencies. So it starts with a question to him from Bloomberg. President Vladimir Putin said in a televised address that he would use all available means in the fight over Ukraine. What's the Foreign Ministry's comment on Vladimir Putin's latest words about the escalation of force on Ukraine? Can I just say that Bloomberg is seriously, very seriously misquoting Putin at this point. Putin did not say that Russia would use all available means, i.e. nuclear weapons, in the fight over Ukraine. He said no such thing. But anyway, that's Bloomberg's question. Wang Wenbin replied as follows. China's position on the Ukraine crisis is consistent and clear. We call on the parties concerned to resolve the issue through dialogue and negotiation and find a solution that accommodates all parties' legitimate security concerns. All parties, of course, includes Russia. We also hope the international community will create conditions and space for that. So then Wang Wenbin got a question from TASS, the official Russian news agency. The People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporozhye said that they will hold referendums on joining Russia from 23rd to 27th September. Do you have any comments on this? And Wang Wenbin replies, China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. We believe that all countries deserve respect for their sovereignty and territorial integrity, that the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter should be observed, that the legitimate security concerns of any country should be taken seriously, and that support should be given to all efforts that are conducive to peacefully resolving the crisis. We call on all parties concerned to properly address differences through dialogue and consultation. China stands ready to work with members of the international community to continue to play a constructive part in de-escalation efforts. And then we have yet another question, this time from Reuters. Just to follow up on the questions about President Vladimir Putin's televised address today, in these remarks, he also said that Russia would launch a partial military mobilization. This is Russia's first mobilization since World War II. As I've already said, that this is simply not true. If one remembers Czechoslovakia in 1968, which Reuters has obviously forgotten. Anyway, to continue, is the Foreign Ministry concerned about how the situation is developing, given that a military mobilization hasn't been announced in such a long time? And Wang Wenbin replied, I already stated China's position on the Ukraine crisis, and I'm not going to go over it again. So, no mention here of a ceasefire. A talk about the talk you would expect from China about respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity. I've said previously in many programs that the Chinese are not going to say anything that contradicts the UN Charter and which appears to give comfort to secession, given China's own concerns about secession. But overall, the Russians will feel that these comments have been supportive of themselves. Now, one country amongst Russia's various friends or quasi-friends did comment about these announcements in ways that were critical, and that predictably was Turkey. The Turkish Foreign Ministry said that they did not support the referendums in the two breakaway republics, and in Kherson and Zaporozhye and all the rest, and they thought that this would not be conducive to the negotiation process. Now, that is a predictable position from the Turks. Turkey has been trying to position itself as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. It came across to me as a very mild statement. I think the Russians will not be especially concerned about it. Now, on the topic of how Bloomberg, in my opinion, has misrepresented Putin's words, I'm going to go and discuss what Putin said about nuclear weapons precisely, because there's been a massive amount of misrepresentation about this, again, in the Western media and by Western governments. And I have to say, I thought that President Biden gave some support to these misunderstandings or misrepresentations of Putin's words in the speech he gave to the United Nations General Assembly yesterday. Anyway, I'm now quoting Putin's exact words, and they come from the Kremlin's website. Washington, London, and Brussels are openly encouraging Kiev to move the hostilities to our territory. They openly say that Russia must be defeated on the battlefield by any means, note the words any means, and subsequently deprived of political, economic, cultural, and any other sovereignty and ransacked. They have even resorted to nuclear blackmail. I am referring not only to the Western encouraged shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which poses a threat of a nuclear disaster, but also to statements made by some high-ranking representatives of the leading NATO countries on the possibility and admissibility of using weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, against Russia. I would like to remind those who make such statements regarding Russia that our country has different types of weapons as well, and some of them are more modern than the weapons NATO countries have. In the event of a threat to the territorial integrity of our country and to defend Russia and our people, we will certainly make use of all weapon systems available to us. That is not a bluff. So what Putin is saying is that there's been some statements and some comments by some people in the West about the West's readiness to use nuclear weapons. Now, he is being, in my opinion here, somewhat economical with the truth. My understanding is that when Western officials have talked about the West using nuclear weapons, it has been in response to Russia conceivably using nuclear weapons. But anyway, it is the case, what is the case is that up to now, all talk of using nuclear weapons in this conflict has been in the West, even when Westerners have attributed that talk to the Russians. What Putin is saying is, look, if you're thinking about using nuclear weapons against us, don't even think of it. We have nuclear weapons too, some of which are more advanced than yours. If you want to go down that road, we have all the means available to counter it, and we will not hold back from using it. So this isn't a threat to use nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine as such. It is a counter to any threat or use by the West of nuclear weapons against Russia. Now, I'm going to come back to that comment about ceasefire, which I saw in Zero Hedge, because there is one place, if you sift through the Chinese media where you will find a reference to a possible ceasefire, and it's in an article by Hu Xijin, who is the former editor of Global Times and who now writes a column on Global Times, in Global Times. And he was obviously, Hu was obviously responding to some extent to all this talk of nuclear weapon, potential uses of nuclear weapons. And I'm going to quote some parts of Hu's article, which, by the way, I find unnecessarily alarmist myself. But anyway, this is what Hu said. The Ukrainian armed forces equipped by the West have become stronger, but their counter-offensive doesn't mean they can reshape the outcome of the war. When the war turns to a life and death struggle, if the West wants to win the final victory, it needs to transcend the confidence and strength that nuclear weapons have given to Russia. And then he goes on to say, in terms of morality and actual interests of mankind, the Russia-Ukraine conflict should not be escalated into a nuclear war at any point. That would be a Pandora's box and would inevitably lead to a series of unimaginable consequences. None of the Russian leaders have explicitly expressed that they would use nuclear weapons. Putin said, when the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal. This has been interpreted as Russia's readiness to use nukes should the war escalate. An emergency brake needs to be put on the situation in Ukraine at a time when the scale of the war is still manageable. There needs to be a ceasefire, this is where the word ceasefire comes from, and negotiations rather than an ever-increasing showdown between Russia and NATO. Please don't forget that there will be no absolute winner or loser in a military conflict between nuclear powers. Whoever tries to completely overwhelm the other side must be crazy. Now, this is a column written by Hu Xijin, and he's undoubtedly a very influential journalist in China, and he's obviously close to the Chinese leadership. But this does look to me like his own article. And what he's talking about here, what he's essentially saying is, look, Ukraine has had some successes on the battlefields with all these Western weapons, but they cannot win the war. The only way that Ukraine can win a war against Russia is if the West becomes directly involved. If the West becomes directly involved, the Russians will construe that as a threat against themselves. And the Russians have said that in that event, they will do whatever it takes to defend their own country. Now, that leads to a risk of an all-out nuclear confrontation between Russia and NATO, which would be an apocalyptic cataclysm for the whole of humankind. Rather than go down that extraordinary and dangerous road, there needs to be a ceasefire between NATO and Russia. So it's a somewhat different concept from the one that you've been reading about in other places. He's basically saying that NATO, that the Western powers need to stop this policy of trying to achieve victory over Russia on Ukrainian battlefields. All that is doing is causing the West to escalate and escalate in reckless and dangerous ways. And the Russians have the means to counter that, and they will use them if they feel their own security and survival as a state is at stake. And rather than do that, NATO needs to draw back, accept some kind of a ceasefire between itself and Russia, in other words, presumably, abandon its efforts to help Ukraine to achieve victory and allow political space for negotiations to take place for a final and full and comprehensive settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. Now that seems to me an entirely reasonable position. As I said, I think this is an alarmist article. I don't think we're anywhere close to that point, because I'm going to say something else now, which is about the Western reaction to these developments. And my impression is that the West has been somewhat taken by surprise. I don't think that they expected that the Russians would announce this kind of mobilization. And I don't think that they expected the referendums to take place in these regions either. And it strikes me that having sanctioned Russia to the point that they have, the Western powers have very few sanctions left that they can realistically impose that are going to make any difference. And direct military intervention by the Western powers in the Ukraine conflict continues to be ruled out. And in terms of arms and weapons supplies to Ukraine, well, they've been already supplied to the extent that they can be. In fact, Western military stocks of weapons have now been dangerously depleted. So I think that we might actually, surprising as this may appear to many people, be past the point of greatest danger. I think that probably sometime in October, November, more probably November than October, we will see a major Russian offensive take place in Ukraine. We may see negotiations of some kind at the conclusion of it. I suspect that we will probably see some sort of end to the Ukrainian crisis as such by some point in the winter, because the forces that are now being gathered are such that, as will enable the Russians to presumably bring this problem to the military aspects of this problem to an end, without the West really having very much more that it can realistically do. I mean, it can try a few things. There have been British submarine drones detected close to Sevastopol. At least the Russians say that they're British. They don't seem to be especially effective, it must be said, at least not these drones, not so far. There might be other things like that lying around. But I suspect that the period of the hot war period of this crisis may be approaching something close to its end point. Ukraine has launched its offensive. It's not achieved any decisive result. Russians are still there, still controlling most of the territory that they captured, and they're now preparing a massive counterblow. But of course, the military crisis, the war crisis in Ukraine, is only, in some respects, the least part of this crisis. The economic crisis continues in the West, continues and worsens almost by the day and almost by the hour, especially in Europe. Yesterday I received a report from Greece about plans to introduce energy rationing there. And it now looks as if energy rationing is inevitable, pretty much across Europe. What that's going to do to the European economy and to European societies, I really cannot even begin to guess, but I can't imagine it will be anything good. And what makes the situation even worse is that I don't really see any end to this crisis. I don't see what Western governments are going to be able to do to turn this problem round in the medium to longer term. Meanwhile, central banks continue to raise interest rates. The Federal Reserve Board has raised interest rates in the United States. The Bank of England has raised interest rates in Britain. Recessions are now inevitable in both the United States and in Britain, or so it seems to me. Well, in Britain, we probably already are in one. There's highly likely a recession already underway in Germany as well. The Bundesbank says that Germany is indeed heading towards recession and towards double-digit inflation. At some point, surely, the penny will drop and Western leaders will have to reconsider the economic war that they are waging. Perhaps, just possibly, and maybe, when the military part of the conflict in Ukraine is ended, that will be the point where the voices will start to say, well, why are we continuing to wage an economic war when the military part of the war has already been lost? My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou made exactly that point in a program with Jackson Hinkle, which we recorded yesterday. Well, we shall see. But for the moment, the economic situation continues to be extremely bleak, and the economic part of the crisis continues to go from bad to worse, and I suspect it will take much more to resolve than the military crisis. I will finish this program by discussing one final topic, which is these prisoner exchanges that have now taken place over the last couple of hours. I should say that they have not been well received in Russia. The Russians released 5 British fighters back to the British authorities. This was mediated by Saudi Arabia, and they've also organized a major prisoner exchange with Ukraine, which has included much of the leadership of the Azov regiment who were captured in Mariupol. Something like 50 Russian troops have been exchanged for over 200 Ukrainians, and also the Russians have been given, apparently they didn't ask for him, but they were given as a kind of favor by the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian politician Viktor Medvedchuk, who was arrested by Ukraine and has been charged with treason and all sorts of other things. That prisoner exchange was brokered by Turkey. Both of these exchanges have been controversial in Russia. Many people in Russia feel that the British mercenaries should have been put through the whole legal process in the Donetsk People's Republic, and there are quite a few people in Russia who would have wanted these people executed. I have made my feelings about that, by the way, absolutely clear. I emphatically do not think that they should have been executed. I think that would have been completely wrong. Secondly, perhaps even more so, there is great anger amongst quite a few people in Russia, and I believe also in Donbass, that the leaders of the Azov regiment in Mariupol have been released. There's a lot of complaints that these people have committed war crimes and should have been charged with war crimes in courts in Donbass. I would say that the terms of their release is that they're not returning to Ukraine. They're going to be kept in Turkey and apparently interned there. Though whether they will indeed live out the rest of the war in Turkey, well, that remains to be seen also. Anyway, putting all that aside, why have the Russians done this? Well, obviously they did want their 55 people back. But the major reason, I have no doubt, is that they want to maintain good relations with these two countries that brokered these agreements, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They want to show to the Saudis and to the Turks that they are friends to these countries, that they are prepared to be reasonable and to act reasonably to Saudi and Turkish requests, because they see both of these countries as important friends and perhaps in future as potential allies in the conflict with the West. So the annoyance and anger of some people in Russia is, from the Kremlin's point of view, a cheap price to pay to keep Crown Prince MBS of Saudi Arabia and President Erdogan of Turkey happy. And I suspect we're going to see a great deal more of this going on. I suspect that this is what Turkish mediation between Ukraine and Russia is from this point on increasingly going to amount to. Erdogan will continue to play a role, but it will be a role of this kind of broker, of exchanges of prisoners, of that kind of thing, until the conflict is finally ended and he and the Russians can move on. Sometimes doing these sort of things is as much part of politics as it is about getting your own people back. And I am no doubt at all that that is the case in this case. Well, there we go. On that final point, I'm going to finish this video today. As you can probably tell, I'm still somewhat unwell. I'm still recovering from my cold, which I contracted over that somewhat disastrous weekend in the Midlands, the English Midlands. But there we go. It is finally, I would say, starting to improve, and hopefully before long, the rest of my programs will begin to become more coherent. Well, thank you for putting up with me. Thank you, by the way, for your many words of support for me over the course of this cold. I'll continue plugging on in the meantime until this cold clears, and beyond that, obviously, and I'll continue to provide you with my own take on the situation in Ukraine and elsewhere. So thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms: Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram. And on Locals, remember, I do my live streams every Wednesday, usually at 1400 hours EST, 1900 hours London time. And they're exclusive to Locals. And if you join us on Locals, you can put questions to me on any topic, and I will answer those questions either during the live stream or in a follow-up video. There are often being large numbers of questions that I need to get through. So join us on Locals, and you can join me in that way. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video, and also you can go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until we speak again.